Cool. Okay, and now we're recording. So welcome everyone to the Digital Identity Attestation Working Group meeting. We have just 2 items on the agenda today. The link to the meeting notes is in the chat right now. I thought maybe we could do the survey one quick. We have someone from Tidelift here, even though they didn't add it to the agenda, they can probably speak to it. And then Gavin's going to lead us through sort of a working group goals and open discussion. We can talk about things that we want to do during this working group. Does that sound good? Any other items people want to add? Quick? No? All right, cool. All right, let's kick it off with the Tidelift survey. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, sure. Well, just a quick little bit about what Tidelift does first, because that'll help provide a little bit of context. So we work with maintainers to improve various qualities of their packages and provide that metadata about that, quality assurances, indemnities, et cetera, to our enterprise customers. And part of how we do that is by having a pretty deep knowledge across, technically we cover something like 40 package managers, including things like the Emacs package manager. As a practical matter, our customers do not care about the Emacs package manager, but nevertheless, there's code. This particular survey was something one of our engineers put together just to sort of survey the state of play in terms of what various package managers do and don't do about signing packages. So I won't bore you by repeating all of the data in there, but suffice to say, the major package managers, you know, the Venn diagram of what's supported is sort of grim, right? Everybody has slightly different ways of looking at the problem, slightly different feature sets that are supported. And so this blog post was an attempt to put together, you know, what we know based on our work, which is in part around figuring out things like how can we work with maintainers of packages to make sure that their stuff is secure, is as secure as possible, right? So, for example, the very first thing we did in that regard was require 2FA. For some package managers, there's an API whether we can check whether it was uploaded with 2FA. For others, we have to sort of take the maintainer's word for it, right? And that's the kind of structure that we're looking to build out. And again, purely coincidentally, that's why I'm, me or somebody from the team, we haven't really fully decided yet, will be joining the identity working group. And we just joined OSSF formally a week or 2 ago. So any questions about it? I'm happy. I didn't put the survey together, but I'm happy to answer as many questions as I can or pass it back to the author.
I work for Gradle. So hi, my name's Jonathan Lightshow. I work for Gradle. It's funny. So I look at Maven Gradle. All packages uploaded in Maven Central are required to be PGP signed, and all 3 package managers have tooling to sign and verify. It is true that we support publishing and uploading signatures. The ecosystem and the amount of usage of actually verifying those certificates is very, like, the adoption of checking those signatures is very limited. I think that, like, right. Gradle is one of the few repositories that actually checks itself and checks its dependencies. But there's currently the state of the ecosystem, at least in the Maven and Java ecosystem, is that it's really hard to do the verification on the user side. So most of the time it doesn't happen.
Right. Well, so one of the things that we're looking at is how we can help our customers do that validation. But yeah, I mean, the state of validation is poor everywhere. As I understand it, and I could talk to the engineer involved, you know, part of what we're doing here was surveying even just whether or not it was possible. Definitely agreed. Gradle is certainly not alone in the gap between what's possible and what actually being done is very large. So. But yeah, I'll pass that feedback on. Let's see if there's anything else we can do around surfacing that kind of data or surveying all of you all for data.
Yeah,
on,
I think the way that it's written crafts a disingenuous reality where, like, oh yeah, these support signing, but actually the reality is it supports signing, which means the authors can sign them. It just doesn't. It means that there's on the verification side that the amount of adoption there is very limited. So it's cool to see that they'll have one side, but I think that representing both sides is valuable here.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I can definitely say that that was not our intent. The more the more uncertainty there is, as a general matter, the more people come to us. So we definitely didn't mean to present it with more certainty than it is. But yeah, I mean, that might actually be a great subject for our follow-up post. Is what's the reality on the ground? So thanks for raising that.
Cool. Any other questions?
No other questions. I'll just say thank you all for having me.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
Sweet. All right, Gavin, do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, sure. So, just thinking through the structure of OpenOSSF and each of the work groups, and this work group's been going for a couple of quarters now. We've had a lot of interesting presentations about identity related technologies and those sorts of things, but we haven't really identified goals and output of the working group, right? What are the things we actually want to get done with that information? So I'm thinking it might be good to at least set some high level goals and things we might want to do through the rest of this year. Obviously, this is entirely a volunteer activity, so we can't enforce anything, but it'd be good to at least have some goals we're working towards and some high level deliverables identified that we might want to pursue. I think the first bullet there, we put quite a bit of time last year into the threat modeling document. That sort of stalled out as we moved into holiday season, right? So we have a lot of work there we could pick up. Other things I've been thinking about is, there's the badging and scorecard projects. Are there elements of identity we want to push there as hallmarks of a secure project? Are there identity specific, white papers we want to look at? As we recommend either best practices or tools, are there any recent supply chain attacks that we want to look at that these things might have mitigated or prevented, that sort of thing. It's certainly a non-exhaustive list. What are our folks' thoughts on any of those directions?
Yeah, I think the exercise we did in the beginning was super helpful, and I'm just looking back to remind myself of all the good stuff we put in there. I think the one thing we could probably start adding to this doc is like the mitigation. So like we identified all the different roles of identity, but I don't think we went through and actually said like how how would a threat at this piece in the supply chain actually be mitigated against, and then putting together, like you were saying, like white paper or best practices or things I think could be really, really valuable. Is something that we strive for. That's just my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the minimum would be kind of these are the general sort of best practices, the kinds of things you should have in place to secure each of those stages, right? Without necessarily recommending specific workflows or tools.
Right.
Yeah, this is David Wheeler. Two quick notes. I think originally the notion of when this working group was formed was that we were going to do that. I think the challenge has been that I think people were expecting we'd hear a couple people, everybody's doing the same thing, and then we'd write that down. And that hasn't been the experience at all.
No, yeah, there's a world of possibilities, right?
Right, it's much harder. Let me speak specifically. You mentioned adding to badging and scorecards. The CI Best Practices badge actually already does have a signed release requirement for the silver level, which isn't the passing level; it's the one level higher. It's called signed releases. The reason it's not in the first passing level is because, as people can unfortunately greatly appreciate, it's hard. And getting people to actually use them, which is the only reason to bother, is even harder. Because if nobody's going to check, why bother? So there are some things. On the other hand, it sure would be great from there to point off to the here's how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal of all these working groups, right, are to make these hard things a bit easier, right, or at least point people in the right direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it makes sense to go look at what they already have there, and either augment or put some actual implementable processes there.
Yeah, so it'd be great if there were some sort of paper of here's how to do it, and then people could point, and not just the best practices, but just people in general could go, oh, that's how you do it.
And I assume you're suggesting a collection of practices and tools that could fulfill those requirements, right?
Right.
This is how you could do it, not how you will do it, right?
Right, how you could do it. Fair enough. Although, could do it or / recommended practices. I think it's more than just you could do it by using carrier or pigeons, but we're hopefully not going to say that sort of thing. So, something. This is a reasonable way. This is a reasonable recommended approach. Not here's how you must do it,
Yeah.
but not here's how you could do it.
I don't really know like how all the working groups work together, or if this may be overstepping, but for salsa, which we presented at the previous meeting, I am intending that this is more than just a set of like recommendations, but really build up an ecosystem of like, here's how you do it. Do, if you're a package owner, you do X, Y, and Z, and boom, you are salsa 3 or whatever. And we have like a kind of like a well-lit path for how to actually reach these things. It's maybe not the only way to do it, but it is like the one recommended way to do it. With salsa, it is like looking at I wasn't involved. I wasn't there for the previous like threat models work. The threat models listed here are wider than what we are talking about with salsa. Because salsa, at least as it's currently proposed, is specifically around like the two principles are auditable and like two-party control or non-unilateral. Versus here, I think there's more threats that are being considered. I don't know like kind of what the best way to proceed is. Like, would it make sense to kind of expand, like, should salsa be like adopted by this working group? Should that be the framework? Should that be one outcome of this? Should it be something else? I guess I don't know exactly how like the different efforts would fit together. Maybe Kim, if you have thoughts, or Gavin or someone. Another option would be to like expand, like if it's so desired by the working group, kind of make the framework larger to address all these threats. I don't know.
Well, salsa it had elements of identity, but its goal wasn't truly around identifying actors, right? It was more about the binary provenance and.
Yeah, I don't quite. I mean, I don't know what is the charter of this specific working group? Sorry that I'm joining it kind of late. It's not like I don't really know what digital identity means, so it's hard for me to say whether it's kind of covers everything or not.
Yeah, there is a charter for it. I'll have to pull it up real quick, but it's just from the name you can guess it involves determining digital identities, being able to show and prove them.
Is that identities of the people involved, or is this identities of software, or both, or identities of services?
Any of those, right? It's identity of any entity that's doing something with any privilege in your project.
Let's see. Let's see here. Objective is to, here's the objective statement from the README. Our objective is to enable open source maintainers, contributors, and users to understand, make decisions on the provenance of origin of the code they maintain, produce, and use.
So that I mean, like from hearing that, it sounds like there's a whole lot of overlap with Salsa. Like our goal with Salsa is to like get something useful, and we don't want to have like another competing, standard or something. If we can take the proposal and morph it into something that's useful for this working group, I think that would be a great outcome.
Yeah, I think, the part with Salsa too is one of the first principles is non-unilateral access. It's something we're striving for, which then again ties back to identity. And then I thought working on Salsa within this working group would make a lot of sense too, because very early on we got some pushback about, just the scope of the working group in general, and other people were asking for more, just broaden the scope around like the supply chain. So that was, some of the motivation for discussing that here.
When folks are talking about supply chain of, say, packages and things, are we talking about, does it make sense to think of, because there was attestation in the title, sort of the witnessing of validation of identity. Is there, I also apologize, I kind of just jumped in, and I know that's kind of how groups work, but as someone who's done, when you're managing, say, large computer systems, and I think kind of the point here is to find where there might be what they call vectors or ways software got in there that you don't know where it came from, or it might have something malicious in it. And then you also want to see where it came from and kind of validate who it came from, things like that. If there's a group, I mean, you could kind of, I don't know if this is a group trying to make a policy, but when you're talking about publishing or, what to do, on the end of, like, say, implementers, you don't want to get into the, like, how you should do this. Like, you should, RMRF this thing, like, you know what I mean? Don't get into the implementation as much as the suggestion that, hey, potentially this entity from this time to this time might have an unverifiable, there's no attestation been done on not only like who these people are, but this set of changes or something. And then also the person that did these changes, they don't meet a bar. Like, kind of, it's not really like identity, like, can they be named? It's more as, is it a strong identity? Has it been proofed? Things like that. And so attestation, as a group, it would be like saying it's reasonable to have this bar where you have to have, I mean, a silly example would be like 5 years of Google location data to this office to prove that you're really the person that worked there, because that would be hard to simulate. And that bar is high enough that we feel like this questionable thing, we should just ask them why it looks so questionable or something, because it is really gray when you start getting into, like, but an easy one is, we don't know who this person is, and they did this commit, and it just went out to every single router. You know what I mean? That one's easy. But having a bar, like if a group sets a bar saying we trust someone at this level, is interesting, I think, and kind of publishing something like that would be interesting. I did try to take a look at Salsa a little before I got here, but and the intent is kind of that same thing. And also, I think these things happen in timeframes. So, what you were calling it? I usually they call it like remediation, but I think it was you used another word. But yeah, what do you do once you find out? Sometimes it's good enough to just go out of that time frame, or uh, honestly, usually it's not just go turn it off everywhere. Companies just want to know how effed they are, kind of thing. Like, how bad is this? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing to bring back up too is it is an explicit non-goal to go after real world identities, right? There's a lot of good reasons not to do that. Kind of went around about that for a while, but identifying people in the real world is not a goal.
I don't think we've actually said it quite that strongly.
I think that's in the README now, but
I think it's something about real identity is certainly described, but I don't think it's quite. We forbid the. I don't think it's we forbid the identity of real people. I think it's don't require the identity of real people, which is a different statement. Let me go click on things. Yeah, I mean, the first goal is give open source maintainers a way to do work under their chosen name and prevent others from impersonating them.
Right. It's strong identity proofing doesn't mean just handing out your personal identifiable information. It's more just strongly I proofing that this is the thing it says it is, whatever that is. And I think we have the tools now to do what some people call like the slider. It's, just reveal as much as necessary, right? We could do that easily now. There's no anonymity, and there's also no full thing you can kind of control. So if someone's like, I don't want them to know my gender, but I want them to know that I wrote this code and it was me, we could do that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the goal, in fact, it says like we're able to work under a pseudonym. It's not requiring people to work under pseudonyms, which is a different statement, I think. For example, I'm actually fine working under my actual real name. Well, at least everybody thinks that's my real name, right? But but others will not, and that's fine as long as we. But I'd still like to know that XYZ is the same XYZ.
But I guess what I'm saying is names are just one, what they'd call a predicate to an identity. So, we're all made up of thousands of things we could say about ourselves that we could prove. And, if I'm a person of color and people are going to not respect my opinion about this software, I may just want to say that here's my ID number and my email. But through the system of strong proofing, like say anonymous proofing or group proofing, where you don't need to reveal certain things about yourself, but you could still prove who you are. It's simple if you say, yeah, I don't mind my name, but other people might have opinions about that or just want to share, but could still be proved. And so I think that goes along with what you're saying. It's not you're not divulging personal identifiable information as in real identity, but you need real identity to validate the person. And that's hard. At least some of it. You just don't need to reveal it. You just need to say, yeah, they're who they say they are.
I'm going to write this down. Note per the README, we do not require revelation of real names. How's that? Is that a reasonable summary? And you can look at the README for details.
Well, I think it's not just name too, right? I think there's a host of sensitive information that could potentially get people in trouble, right? Location as well. So I think we probably need to flesh that out. From a tools perspective, whether it's salsa or anything else, I think if we recommend any particular tool, it should be a public project under neutral governance. Don't want it to look like a vendor push. What do folks think about that?
The tool should be neutral. Is that what you're asking?
Well, if we're going to recommend tools and specific software, right, it should be a public project that's under neutral governance.
That seems fairly non-controversial. Not like identity.
If we do end up with a lot of abstract policy and like advice, kind of like salsa versus concrete steps and implementations, it might slow down adoption of these policies because most people don't really want to understand in depth how all this stuff works and what to do. They want to be given a set of instructions and follow them and like implement better supply chain security practices. So I understand the desire not to be biased towards a specific tool, but at the same time, if you don't give concrete advice with the tools people already have, we're not really going to achieve anything.
If I can jump in, those of you who don't know, I lead the CI Best Practices Badge project. We had a lot of experience and built on previous experiences too, of the criteria say this is the actual requirement, and it's very high level. You can meet it 1,000 ways, and then but it's very specific. This is the criterion, and then hey, here's some guidance for typical cases. Here's a way you would typically meet that. It's not a requirement. You can do it other ways, but these are ways that will meet. And I think it is challenging to make that split, but it also means that your criteria are going to last. So, somebody makes a better tool. Great. You can use the better tool. You don't need to change the criteria. You just have a better way to implement the criteria. Great. But it is true that if you don't give any people any hints about how to do it, hey, don't worry, just take a year of research and you'll figure this out. That's not going to happen. People won't do it. If you turn it into a research project, people won't do it.
Yeah, I think in some of the stuff, in the salsa proposal is almost like a step, I don't know, higher, if higher is the right word, but like even just looking at the basics of like the source code management systems and builders that exist, like, one of the things we want to do with salsa is work with the community on defining like what are strict requirements we should have for all of the source code management systems. Like, if you can't even trust those, and like, what do you have at the end of the day? So, it's a lot of things that people are already using and in their workflows. And then of course, popular CI/CD tooling, and what does it mean to be a secure builder? What properties should a secure builder have? What policy should you be able to apply against stuff that's coming out of the builder, things like that. So I don't know if folks have internally in their organizations and stuff ways that you evaluate those types of things now. Like, how do you know that you can trust even the source code management systems? Are you just trusting them blindly? Do you just trust that the information that's given to you on commits is what is supposed to be there? So
Yeah, I mean, as you described that problem, Kim, I'm biased because I work every day in the public key infrastructure world these days, but it sort of reminds me of like the root trust program guidance and CA browser forum guidance for web certificate authorities, where, everyone gets together periodically and agrees on criteria that these publicly trusted certificate authorities are audited against. Yeah. Around, how they issue certificates, but also operational things like, their signing keys have to be in HSMs, and the root signing key can't be online. You have to like physically enter a command into a keyboard. So they sort of, it's not a piece of software. It's an agreement.
Right.
Yeah, I'm familiar with government programs where there's a spec, and then there's basically questions for interpretation, and you get people together, and hopefully it's a public discussion. I think that's key. Is you have to interpret texts, and that's okay, but it's not fair to interpret them in a quiet building and poof, and here's your answer without any ability to question it. But the idea of here's the criteria, here's some guidance. Oh wait, what the heck is that? And a way to say here's how we interpret this, and a process so that you can figure out, does this meet the real goal? I will say that one thing that I found really, really helpful in some cases, and we tried to do this for the CI best practices also, is we had rationale for not just here's the criteria, but we also documented why is this criterion there at all. And when you're trying to well, wait a minute, I have this weird way of doing it. I don't know if that meets the letter or spirit of the law. Well, what's the point of that? Oh, the point is to do this. Well, this totally fails. Well, then, or you know what, that doesn't. Then, so and that would be. I think that's I don't want to say, hey, salsa folks, do lots more work, but I think that would be a good thing. Would be a little bit, and I know you're trying to make it short to start with, and I commend that. But it might be useful for anything we do, be it salsa or if this working group does salsa, or anything else we do, try to have some rationale so that we can know whether or not a particular approach actually does the job.
Yeah, that sounds good. One other thing, one other aspect, because you mentioned like effectively you have these standards and someone has to interpret whether a particular system actually implements those things. One of the things that we are proposing with SALSA is that we don't think it's practical that everyone is going to agree on those. Like different organizations will have different kind of levels of trust. Like I won't name particular orgs, but like one organization like maybe would trust another, like, yes, we believe that they're going to do the right thing. We, according to our threat model and like the level of security that we want, that's good enough. But another org might not. They might say, no, we're not going to trust just anyone. We're only going to pick and choose. And so I think kind of like thinking about that as a first-class concept is kind of worthwhile. That, you know, effectively, whether or not something meets a requirement is according to someone, right? Like the CI best practices thing would be like according to the way the CI best practices interprets their requirements. We call that accreditation in our framework, but I don't know if that's the best word.
I think there's in large organizations, if it's impossible to validate or audit. I just looking back at the SLAs or the SALSA stuff, unless in a way like the extreme would be unless everything's tracked, like every single dependency has already been solved. You can't audit. And so what some of us are finding, like I'd say in the field doing this stuff day after day, is that unless there's really no way around the fact that like if you arrive here from like say Docker, there's no way to get around the fact that essentially there's no articulated policy, and software writing, programming, or even Docker files is not actually policy until there's like an abstract articulated policy that says what you're using in a declarative fashion. It's impossible to actually go back through and solve for where the dependencies are. And on top of that, everyone here is basically asking for a system of transitive trust when there's just this lack of basic policy around these things. So writing, say, a build job or even following the rules of best practice of CI, unless every single dependency has been called out, just letting OSs roll in or Docker containers roll in or whatever it is that's bringing in other software. You need a policy that says at least declaratively what you use or what you have your policy, because otherwise you have a system where, it's reactive where, oh, someone got hit on the street, let's put a crosswalk, and then someone gets hit again, and then the street's all crosswalks. Without the policy, you got to come from that direction, which is to say, even if you start small, which is we know that the curl was compromised. Now we have a policy about curl, and we know where we use it. And unless you have that, it's almost impossible to do any kind of backtracking. But also, we're finding that it also helps to actually reason about what you all are trying to do as your working group, which is people can articulate their policies for themselves, and then they can check their list against stuff people are finding or vulnerabilities. And so, but without that kind of common communication language, it's almost like we're looking into things like, can you actually attest, like, is there a deed for your, or a title or some kind of license for your CI? And can it be attested? And then can I check that for vulnerabilities? And then I'll sign off on that and say you did a good job. And I will take on that liability like a house inspector. So this stuff is going on. That's why we kind of found this group. But without those policies, it's just needle and haystack stuff. It's complex, the depth solving.
I guess the big question then is where do we want to go from here?
I mean, I would suggest, like, with especially around identity or security of supply chains and software, I would propose that there should be at least some kind of start of a document that is sort of like either the policy that is recommendations, like you said, it shouldn't be too abstract, it should be implementable, or some kind of way to advise people on how to articulate their own policy so that tools like Salsa can better, like, there's not such an impedance mismatch, so like it's or something like helping people understand, one, are you able to map your supply chain, and two, to hold it up to something that says there's issues over here that someone found, or this has not been validated, right? You're using things that no one knows who wrote it or something like that. So I guess I'm saying writing things down in an abstract policy that isn't software might potentially be a necessity, because software is not a good policy. Even if you write your jobs or you have sort of software policies around what's being built and how it's all fits together, it's not as good as an abstract declarative policy. Is one of the things I think. If that's a little wonky, sorry, it's hard to describe these things. But one layer outside of the software itself, to say what you're trying to do, would help a lot to be able to track these things down and then have conversations around them about safety and things.
Sorry, I had to step away for a quick second and not following everything. There's tree people coming to my house. So I'm not, I don't know if you might be willing to write down some of the stuff that you're thinking about so we can sort of ingest it a bit more. I mean, with the salsa thing, like what I envision is, once we sort of all agree on basic principles and terminology and everything, that like just the salsa levels could be used as part of policy. So you could, as an organization, be able to say, I don't want anything going in production that only meets salsa level 1, or everything has to meet salsa level 3, or the builder that I'm using, it needs to meet the salsa level 1 for all the components in like the builder. So I'm not quite sure that's related to what you're talking about.
Exactly.
But that's sort of how we envision the work going forward.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Like you said, where do you actually write down that sentence that we want to be salsa level 3? There's things called, I want to be CIS level 2 on all my computers, but it's not a statement, it's something you write down, and that ends up being the policy I'm talking about. So even us saying that as a group, we want to be salsa level 1, and we all write that down, then we can all, there's something there. Or each one of us say that, and then you have your diverse policies, and then it starts to work that way. So I'm not sure where you write that. That's kind of the...
Well, I think we're trying to agree on those definitions first, because open source isn't only controlled or owned by one person. We need to work with a community to actually define what that criteria is. And we put a first draft up there and left a few blanks that we were hoping folks would want to help us fill out. We can certainly put our own ideas of what we would think should be recommended at those different criteria, and then once we have that sort of in agreement and people are happy with it, then I think then the policy part comes in, and that could be like per organization, or depending on the different use cases. Maybe certain things in your stack you're fine with it only meeting SALSA 1 criteria, but maybe anything that doesn't meet SALSA 3, for example, you would want to take a closer look at what changes are going, what changes are happening, and what data it's touching and whatnot.
I'm not one of the SALSA authors, but I did read it. I see Mark Lodato's on here, and he should probably speak up and correct me. But my understanding from reading it is that specifically talking about SALSA, because of the very problem that Stephen Locke, I believe, has mentioned, that trying to figure out total transitive closure for everything is really hard. The SALSA folks have explicitly said, the level is for this particular product, not for the things that get included. If you want those, you transitively reapply SALSA to those. Now, you can argue that that has a problem. Obviously, you can have this high SALSA level and bring in garbage, but I think I actually see the wisdom in what they're doing, because I think we have to start walking before we run, and very few projects are going to be able to say, not only do we do this, but the entire transitive closure does. I think that's unlikely. If anything, you can work one level back, and that's probably the best any one project can do. And even then, it's going to be limited. And Mark, feel free to, or Kim, feel free to correct everything I said.
No, that's exactly right. And just to be clear, because I know like no one is like super aware of all the ins and outs of our proposal. Like SALSA is not a tool. It is. It's actually kind of it overlaps very heavily, as I understand it, with this working group, which is like the mission, which is to propose a set of standards for like what we think software like organizations or software supply chains, what properties we think they should have. Those we're calling standards. Some accreditation process for like how you verify that those standards are met, and then a specific set of recommended tools that you can use to accomplish that and actually, in practice, achieve it both as a software producer and a software consumer. But it wouldn't be mandated tools. It would be like, here's like the well-lit path of if you do the A, B, and C, kind of everything that works.
Those first two goals are also roughly charter of the badging program too, right? I mean, is there overlap? Are they intended to be parallel and complementary? I mean, what's the
Sorry, I'm not familiar.
Interaction there?
You presumably mean the CI best practices badge?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've reviewed. They're not identical. I haven't really talked to Mark about what's overlapped and not overlapped, but there's a whole bunch of things in the CI best practices badge that aren't in SALSA. The CI best practices badge is way more focused on things that you should be doing to increase the likelihood that you're going to produce good code. And there's some other thing, and SALSA, for example, is really heavily focused on the what I call what has, at least in the last couple decades, been called two-person control. I keep forgetting the name that you call it, but at least in the military, it's been called two-person control. And the problem with two-person control is that most open source projects can't do it. So the CI best practices badge doesn't even try to get there till gold. It's only at the topmost level that we impose anything that would require multiple people. And I've forgotten the other one was.
Which is true of SALSA as well. We also have like a 3 level. Right.
Yeah. So it's a different set of criteria. So one hand clapping. What? I don't get it.
I was
Sorry.
just making a joke. If you're a single person project, it's hard to validate. Just like,
Yeah, actually, no, that's not true though. There's a huge number of things you can do as a single person project to reduce risks. And sure, multiple people's better. I don't think anybody doubts that. But the question is, what for those projects that don't have that, what can you do? And the answer is quite a bit.
To
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Stephen.
to make it more clear, kind of where I would. So I do see a distinction here, and it'll probably help. What Mark is talking about, I think, in some ways, is how you're sort of defining on what good looks like. I'd say I'm someone who could take that and run it on computers. So what we do is we take complex government level STIGs and NIST stuff, and you have to lower it down into something you can check, or like it's kind of the reverse of how you read your SALSA page, which is take those policies and then make it checkable across that whole depth chain. And so some of us are when I would like to participate in some of the more like what good looks like. But honestly, once it's like I know how to write it down and run it on computers and give you an answer. And that's like anyone from sort of the traditional config management space, security, compliance. This is all we do. So if that helps, it's like once we know what it looks like, even if it's just one thing, I can run it all the way through, if that makes sense. And so your Docker example is really great once you know what you're looking for. And where we meet is that sort of, maybe it's some sentences, but it's hard to run some sentences on a computer. And so I think your intent here is, categorizing risk and sort of defining trust and mapping it to these complex software pipelines. But once you know kind of what good looks like, if we can write it in some format, like essentially like something a computer understands, or lower it down into things, we can actually make checks and actually do some actual running of these things, assertions, and give people some idea of how vulnerable they are, and where it's at. That's the part at scale. So if that helps, it's like I'm no policy expert, but I'm a compliance expert. Let's add remediation, if that makes sense. So, but you can't run what you didn't write unless you tell me what they're going to the doctor and they say what's wrong. You got to tell them somewhere to start looking. So,
and just to be clear for the salsa piece, like we are proposing those two principles, auditable and two-party control, because that's what within Google we've found a useful, manageable thing that we could actually accomplish and do it at scale. But we're not tied to that being the only set of principles, or if the working group thinks like there ought to be some other principle that's orthogonal to those and that should be added. Like, again, I just want to make it clear, like, it's not like we're saying here's salsa, does it work, but rather like we would like to help achieve this mission. Here's a starting point that we think might be helpful.
Yeah, and I think one of the differences is salsa, with the exception of two-person, which does get into development, a lot of it is really more focused on the after it's delivered, how do I make sure it gets out and signed and so on, which I think is distinguishing. It's not that with the Google folks' permission, I'm sure we could steal some things into the badge too. So,
well, that was kind of my point, right? It just feels like we're getting super fragmented already, right? Not even 6 months into the life of the foundation. If there's concepts in salsa that are useful, then contribute those into the badging program. If there's other stuff that doesn't belong there, then find a home for it.
Yeah, we should. I didn't realize you were the owner of the badging thing, David. That we should definitely talk about that and how like we could like put those together. Yeah, I agree. It should not be fragmented. I think it should be seamless.
Actually, to be fair, I mean the LF does not mind having multiple things running. If you watch how the CNCF works, there are for any particular things at least 5 different projects that do the same thing. It confuses
but that's just a nightmare for end users, right? There's these dozen things. Which one are the ones that I focus on, right? If the goal of this foundation is to make things easy for projects, then having a well-defined path through the recommendations is critical.
Yeah, I mean, I when I was looking at the badge program again too, I saw enough differences where I'm not sure if you could take like all the criteria we have in Salsa today and apply it to the different badge levels, because there's more of, more of the supply chain sort of connected piece in there. And like, when you look at them, David, do you think like we could take all the criteria from Salsa and apply it to the different badging levels?
I mean, there's no problem copying text from one place to another.
Sure.
I had not focused that way. My goal is to let salsa be salsa, but could we? I suspect at least some of them, sure. The bigger challenge, and I think it's a procedural challenge, as I said, and I think Mark and I have already talked about this, and I've already alluded to it earlier. The challenge for the mini projects that don't have multiple people. But for some of these, I think that wouldn't be hard. I have not focused on it that way because I don't want it to feel like I'm stealing your thunder. It's not what I've goal is.
When I just took a look, I was like, could this fit? And it felt like, to me, best practices was more about like the general hygiene of a project and everything. And I wasn't sure if like Salsa criteria in spirit would map well within the existing levels. But yeah, certainly something we could.
Yeah, you know what? One thing we could do is just take a look and try to see, because if indeed a lot, even if they all don't fit, if some fit, that would make it easier for somebody to do salsa if they're doing the badges, and we can go from there. But we could certainly see if it could fit in that framework.
Yeah, maybe that's something we can do. Set some time aside and do.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Mark, I mean, if you're willing to have some time, we can kind of sit down and just kind of talk through what that might look like. And it's okay if it doesn't work out, but we can. And it wouldn't be surprising if some are harder and some are easier, and we'll know. Then we'll know more.
Yeah, we should. I mean, you and I have a meeting planned for later today, scheduled for later today. We could go through and kind of see like where's the overlap and where the difference is. I would imagine the two, as I understand it, which is a little bit shaky. There's two main differences. One is like the principles or the focus is different. Like the set of threats we're worried about there's probably a little bit of overlap there, and I don't know as much here. Like Salsa is more focused on like an end-to-end guarantee that when you receive a software artifact, that all those properties were true throughout this entire supply chain and weren't subverted. Whereas the best practices badge is more about the intent. I think of like, this is configured to do it properly, but no verification at the end that it was done properly. Is that inaccurate?
Well, it gets a little murky because, as I mentioned, for example, there are when you get to silver, all of a sudden there's requirements to do signed. There's requirements to do signatures. And I'll note, but by the way, you've been worried about reproducible builds. That's a gold requirement. So it's a straight up, which is something Salsa does not guarantee, is reproducible builds, and that is a requirement for the gold badge for CI best practices. So, so it's not it's not as simple. The honest answer is, hey, what are you worried about, and how do you counter it? Was the answer to what criteria were put there. So it's multiple countermeasures for various situations.
And really, it's probably, it's probably more of an existential question for the TAC or the board, right? Which is, at the foundation level, is that the intention that, the goodness of the working group sort of aggregates at a couple of touch points for end user projects to consume, or is it more of an a la carte? Each track is independent and has its own set of recommendations and tools and things, and people just, go in and choose what they want. Those are super different models.
Would the goal in some ways to be to help smaller projects then kind of have some kind of way to do very efficient transitive trust to a larger thing? Is that or is it more like, is that, and then this group sort of maintains or helps build that larger thing, kind of like a commons of trust for this stuff, for the supply chains? Or is it because I will say I don't, and this might be more on the, like, I don't want it to make it like a technical thing, but I will say that these graphs sum. So it's more like a basketball bracket than a supply chain, which is you can trust the person who everyone else trusted. So for these small projects, it will sum for them. But so intense for I think, and so for these giant graphs that we're talking about, giant dependencies all through this chain, what's cool is it actually sums, and so you can actually trust everybody up to some certain point, and you're good. So like for a small project, they can just start by sort of trusting a larger entity, and while they figure out whether their house is in order from there on out. Is that kind of the model that people are talking about? Because it is insurmountable if you're saying that someone who writes curl is responsible for curl being in a Docker image distributed by Docker, then used by everyone. That's really tough, right? And so, but it does sum, so you can do it in very small, tiny little increments on both ends and work your way through, and it just adds up, like map reduce.
Yeah, I mean, like as David mentioned, the one thing we were thinking with also is like to make it so each piece can be done independently. You don't have to wait for all your dependencies to do something for you to be like get the check mark or something like that. I think is
The math works on that. Yeah.
Yeah, parallelize, etc.
Okay, I have to bounce in 1 minute, but
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Sorry to throw a grenade there in the 5 minutes before the end of the meeting.
I mean, if we don't have any agenda topics, maybe we continue this conversation next week, Gavin. Or next meeting. I don't know if we got to the whole crux of what we were trying to drive in terms of goals, but I thought it was a healthy discussion nonetheless.
Yeah, and this is all completely normal growing pains for any new foundation, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to know what folks are excited about and want to work on too. I mean, I can't even tell Google engineers what to do. I just have to get them excited about working on specific things. So, other working groups have projects, so it's really obvious what folks are working on together. This one, there's no real projects right now, just a bunch of standards and white papers and things, which I think is all great because that's the first step is people have no idea what they're supposed to be doing and what to be worried about. So I think things that we do will add value in one way or another. All right, but I got to bounce. So thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you all next time.